Wow. Watching our countdown, we've accomplished so much in the last year. Hi, everyone. My name is Michelle, and I'm the founder of Women in Climate. We're so glad to have you join us from around the world for Bold 2024 in honor of International Women's Day. In 2022, myself and Stephanie Corbally, our community builder, decided to start a community in New York. We had 10 people in our Slack, 10 followers on LinkedIn, and no newsletter. Today, we're 3,600 plus in our Slack, 16,000 on LinkedIn, and our monthly newsletter goes out to thousands of subscribers. This is a testament to our community. We are entirely volunteer run, including myself, and with very little, we've accomplished so much. Special thank you to all of our volunteers that helped produce Bold: Carter Schmidt, Natasha Lekwa, Simran Heer, Melissa Dusenberry, Stephanie Corbally, and Stephanie Chen, and all our volunteers that engage our global community, including our 80+ city leads. We hosted the first Bold last year, and the goal was to talk about important issues and create dialogue towards solutions. I'm incredibly proud of our programming this year, and I'm excited for you to meet the speakers who will contribute to very dynamic conversations today. Be sure to stay to the end. You will not want to miss Leslie Field on the topic of refreezing the Arctic and Jojo Mehta on making ecocide a crime. You can interact with other viewers on We Don't Have Time's app or on Women in Climate's Slack channel or on X. A special thank you to our supporter Alight and media partner We Don't Have Time. Now, I'd like to pass the torch to Catherine Bannett, our Women in Climate board member, who was a speaker last year and decided she wanted to roll up her sleeves and join our board to advance our mission. Catherine, we're incredibly lucky to have your leadership. Over to you. Catherine, we're going to have you unmute.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
We'll try that again. Apologies, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, and evening, wherever you are around the world. Welcome to Bold. Since Michelle Lee, CEO, founded Women in Climate 2 years ago, we have witnessed incredible growth. It's my belief this growth is because we fit an otherwise unmet need to find community as we work to change the world and save the planet. Michelle's ability to make everyone feel welcome and valuable is a unique gift. When I became aware of the power of a sustainable investing in 2011, while at the New York City Pension Plan, a lot of people thought it was about tree hugging rather than the economic contribution of things like climate to the price of a stock. We've come a long way, but there is more to go. We kick off today with a topic that underscores the vast significance of the issues we face: climate and national security. If most of Southeast Asia is underwater, as projected, we will have 100 million people on the move. We have seen the geopolitical challenges of large migrations that are a fraction of that size. The national security implications are overwhelmingly complex. Much has been written about how climate displacement disproportionately affects the underserved, including women and children. And yet we see women are underrepresented at COP and in boardrooms, and our panelists will discuss that. Women are 51% of the population, We make 80% of the purchasing decisions, and we control 40% of the global wealth. Yet so many of us feel disempowered. Imagine if we double down on helping each other and our planet. Imagine if women showed up in droves to save Mother Earth. Women in Climate is a community of women interested in climate. Thank you for being part of our community today.
Thank you for your words of wisdom, Catherine. Very inspirational. Next up, a conversation I've been excited for the whole week. Our keynote, Sherry Goodman, on climate and national security. Sherry Goodman is a seasoned leader in the national security space. Sherry serves as Vice Chair of the U.S. Secretary of State's International Security Advisory Board. She is also the Secretary General of the International Military Council on Climate and Security, representing over 40 military and national security organizations addressing security risks of a changing climate. We recorded our conversation with Sherry earlier this month. Let's bring her on stage. It's great to have you with us, Sherry. We're so excited to chat with you today, and I'm going to jump straight into my first question. Why is climate a national security matter?
Well, thank you, Michelle, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today and this audience. Climate is a national security matter because climate change acts as a threat multiplier, aggravating other security risks we face around the world. Threat multiplier is a term I coined back in 2007 with the first group of U.S. generals and admirals who took a deep dive into the national security implications of climate change at a defense think tank called the Center for Naval Analysis. We spent a year learning from the world's leading climate scientists and other officials about the impact of climate change on our security, and then using the expertise of our generals and admirals and military analysts to examine what those implications are. And we see now that it increases our risks around the world, whether it's in great power competition or it's in terrorism, weapons of mass destruction. General instability is aggravated because climate risks add to all of the severe security threats we face with 2 wars around the world and a major peer adversary. Climate is just all in this mix as a compound and a cascading risk.
Wow. So many words and terms that we don't really use on a daily basis, like threat multiplier, but we should really be adding to our vocabulary. So Sherry, when it comes to the US, what would you consider the biggest threats?
Well, we face a variety of threats in the US and around the world. The main threat is that we have tended to think of climate as sort of adding one extra dimension to these other risks that I've just described, whether it's competition with Russia or China, or whether it's the terrorist threat, or whether it's weapons of mass destruction. But climate actually is multiple risks at the same time. So, for example, we might have a more extreme hurricane or extreme weather event or a fire event. That is one event, but often they occur on top of long-term trends from climate change that have already made us more fragile and less stable. For example, parts of the US experience now long-term drought, as do parts of Africa and the Middle East. And when you have extreme weather events on top of the long-term drought or fire on top of areas that have already suffered from devastating rains and landslides, those risks compound and cascade, and they make the combination of that puts more lives at risk. We are constantly now sending our military forces in as emergency responders to back up our firefighters and our search and rescue crews that are responding to floods, hurricanes, fires, and other events, both around the country and increasingly around the globe.
That's really fascinating, Sharon. I think when we think about the military, sometimes we don't always associate it with extreme weather, but more and more we're deploying these resources, and it's definitely impacting our national security because of that. Um, how should we be thinking about climate and national security on a global scale?
Well, we should think about it as affecting missions, not only emissions. So it affects the missions that the military will need to perform. In other words, more search and rescue, more natural disaster assistance and humanitarian relief, but also compounding the other risks that we face around the world and making more areas less stable because of prolonged drought. For example, across parts of Africa and the Middle East and South Asia, the prolonged drought has led to food and water insecurity in regions that were already fragile because of political instability or poor, weak governance, because of lack of robust institutions or lack of education or treatment of women and girls. All these things make societies less capable. And then you add the natural system change of climate, the climate changes to the earth system, and that leads to further instability where people can't grow the crops the way they used to. So agriculture is weaker. People don't have the same resources for water. So traditional farmers and herders in parts of Africa and the Middle East that had lived peaceably before now find themselves more in conflict over water resources. So it's upending what we thought had been a predictable Earth system. And now we have to plan for a world that's much less predictable.
Yeah, predictability, the threat multipliers that are out there. We really need to pay attention and take action soon. Um, as I was learning more about climate and national security, Sherry, one of the topics that kept coming up in the literature was the Arctic. And we don't really talk about the Arctic very much, but we really should. The Arctic is key. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, Michelle, thank you for saying it. The US is, of course, an Arctic nation. Um, What if you're in New York, Washington, San Francisco, Texas, you're not always thinking about that. Um, but the Arctic has changed rapidly in our lifetimes. I mean, it has become a new ocean that's opened up for navigation. And by Russia, it is seen as a toll road for transportation across Russia's northern sea route. And in the future, we could see an ice-free Arctic in the summer as soon as the next decade because of the rapidly retreating sea ice, collapsing permafrost, and rising temperatures. So we'll see more economic competition for trade routes. We also see potentially more competition for the energy and mineral resources that are thought to be vast across the Arctic. Even China has declared itself a near Arctic stakeholder and one with claims to Arctic activities as well. So we now have an area that is competitive where it had been a zone of cooperation. And there's so much at stake in the Arctic because it's changing faster than any place else on the planet. Temperatures rising as much as 4 degrees, and a whole region of the planet that's just become completely gone from white to much more green and collapsing permafrost and rising temperatures. And it's still very dangerous to operate in the region, but it's changing rapidly with eyes on the prize of both the trade routes, the energy, and ultimately the migrating fish stocks. As you know, as climate changes the ocean temperatures and as fish become overfished or illegally fished in other parts of the world, fish patterns are changing and they're moving towards both poles, and those regions will have more productive fisheries, in the future. So all of that leads to increased potential strategic competition around resources in the Arctic.
Very important information. Thank you, Sherry, for sharing all those points. And I think you've given us a lot to think about. Now, Sherry, you have a book coming out later this year. Can you tell us more about it?
Well, thank you very much, Michelle. I'm happy to, and I hope I have a chance to speak to your listeners and the audience about my book, Threat Multiplier: Climate, Military Leadership, and the Fight for Global Security. It takes readers onto the battlefield and inside the Pentagon to show how the U.S. military is confronting the biggest security risk in global history: climate change. We learn how the military evolved from an environmental laggard to a climate and clean energy leader over the last several decades. And we discover how a warming world exacerbates every threat, from hurricanes and forest fires to terrorism and power plays in Russia and China. The Pentagon now considers climate change in war games, disaster relief planning, international operations, international diplomacy, and even the design of our own military bases. And having served as the Pentagon's first chief environmental officer, the first deputy undersecretary of defense for environmental security, I can give readers a front row seat to the military's fight for global security, a tale that is as hopeful as it is harrowing.
I love that, Sherry. It is as hopeful, and hopeful is a really important word that we should keep in mind as well. Sherry, thank you so much for sharing your insights today. I think the audience is going to walk away with a lot of new things to think about and important things that they should learn about. Thank you so much again, Sherry. We're so glad to have you with us today.
Thank you, Michelle. It's been a pleasure.
Wonderful. Wow, what incredible insights from Sherry. I'll definitely be rewatching her segment and spending more time learning about matters related to the Arctic, and I'm looking forward to reading Sherry's book. Next up, we have our Women, Climate, and Boards panel. Elaine, over to you.
Thank you, Michelle. I'm Elaine Rubin, and I recently joined the board of Women and Climate. I've spent my career driving digital transformation and capitalizing on emerging trends and business growth opportunities. I've been on 8 boards, and I'm currently on 2, and I am thrilled to have the opportunity to moderate this bold discussion on how we can best leverage boards to accelerate climate action, and how can we get more women on boards and help them thrive. So it is my pleasure to introduce our panel today, Elaine Chung, a bean counter turned strategic transformational corporate CFO and board member for-profit and nonprofit boards. She is currently on 2 boards, WWF International and Novatech Health, where she is the chair of the Finance and Investment and Audit Committees. She was raised in San Fran, spent the majority of her career in Hong Kong, and now is joining us late night from her home in Singapore. Lara Martini is a CMO, 25 years in technology and digital transformation, now an advisor to green tech entrepreneurs, and a board member on 3 boards: Magna Housing, a housing association, AQA Education, and Thomas Telford, the trading arm of Institution of Civil Engineers. She has lived and worked in Europe, the Middle East, Latin America, the US, and now she is in the UK. And finally, Stacy Swan, a finance practitioner with more than 25 years of experience in project finance, investment, climate change, climate investments, and sustainability. Stacy works with impact investors, financial institutions, corporations, and policymakers on issues at the nexus of climate change and investment. She is an active director of the Montgomery County Green Banks Board, where she is also the chair of their investment committee. She sits on the boards of Windrock International and Climate Policy Initiative and is joining us from Washington, D.C. So welcome, ladies. Very excited for our discussion today. Before we kick off, we thought it would be helpful to just give a little bit of context. There are many different types of boards: for-profit, public, private, nonprofit associations and organizations across many different industries and geographies. So as you will hear from our discussion today, the priorities and role of a board will vary depending on the mission, the goals, the composition of the board, and most importantly, who the stakeholders are: governments, investors, owners, members, suppliers. So we have the perfect panel of incredible women on boards from different regions and different industries and backgrounds, and with different journeys to their board work. So I think we should get started. And Stacy, perhaps you can start us off with really giving us a sense of what is the role or purpose and objective of a board.
Well, thank you, Elaine, and it's lovely to be here, and I'm so excited to have this conversation with Elaine and Laura and you as well. So boards are super important in both providing the guidance and direction of organizations, but also helping them achieve their overall objectives and goals, and also kind of creating accountability, a sense of risk management. It's a little bit of a check and balance function inside an organization, and board functions in the ecosystem of how organizations are run are pretty critical, because the management of an organization, which usually reports to the board, is knee-deep in the weeds of the day-to-day operations, the day-to-day objectives, the day-to-day people management, potentially meeting kind of quarterly targets or annual targets. And the board is usually there to take a higher level view, almost like a perch on the whole organization, and provide those kind of guardrails and guidance to the management of an organization in terms of what they need to look at, what they need to be thinking about, what they need to be engaged in. The other thing that boards are pretty useful for is doing that in very specific, I would say, categories that all organizations need to be mindful of and be minding. And the way I tend to think about that is most boards have committee structures, and those committee structures, there's a couple of committee structures which are common across all boards. You usually have an audit and finance committee that tends to be, very helpful in terms of making sure the financial kind of management of an organization is done well. You usually have a committee that's looking at risk and liability or legal issues, again, at a high level, providing guidance to the management team, not micromanaging the organizations per se, but really being there as both a sounding board and a kind of direction provider. And there are other committees that boards tend to have, some around HR, always around strategy, that give you a sense of kind of where the board sits in terms of its role and function in terms of the success of an organization.
Awesome. Thank you. I think to get a good perspective here, I'd love to hear from each one of you, and perhaps we'll start with you, Elaine. On the boards you currently serve or have exposure to, where is climate in this discussion? Is it a strategic priority? And I know it might vary across different boards and experiences. So I'd love to hear, Elaine, what you have to say about that.
Yes, absolutely. So for example, at WWF, we're the world's largest conservation organization. So climate change is actually part of the reason why we exist. So we need to understand climate risk and its impact on nature and people. So it scores high on our board. Now, on the other hand, when I'm on a corporate board, we don't necessarily talk about climate risk as a standalone topic. We talk about it in the context of the many various rapid external developments around us, such as cybersecurity, future of work, AI, or regulatory changes. So we need to really understand these external factors, or factors themselves, is really understanding what is the relevance to the organization and what's the impact to our strategy, identifying the risk as well as the opportunities, and then decide, take action, and drive accountability. Now, what is it I mean by relevance? So for example, when the EU deforestation regulation came in to effect, we had to really understand what is the importance to the supply chain? How do we track the transparency? What is the cost of compliance? And potentially, could there be a competitive advantage if the organization can comply versus our competitors cannot? So it's really understand all of that the board and depending on the nature of the business and
So
operations.
just so a quick question, if I asked you on a scale of 1 to 10, obviously for WWF, it's very, very high. And in corporate boards, what's the number you would give in terms of people talking about climate?
3 or 4?
Mm.
Yes, I would agree. Laura, what's your experience?
So I think it really varies by sector, as Elaine was saying. I'm on very different boards, and obviously in the built environment, the level of awareness is bigger just because this has been an issue for longer. Now, in terms of the role of the board, our role is to go broad rather than deep, but it's also to determine the playing field. Keeping an organization true to its mission, we can also define what that mission is. And is it evolving and changing as we go? So is the well-being and the social engagement and the social impact of the organization meaningful, and how much? Is the way we work with stakeholders meaningful, and how much? So Elaine mentioned competitive advantage. I would say it's also collaboration. Who do we engage? How does the organization work with others in the same space in looking at innovation, in looking at best practices, in influencing standards? For a long time, some of the built environment standards have been held back because security regulations were not allowing newer form of cement. And then we had to work with the regulation in demonstrating the newer cements that allow to capture carbon or use less carbon intensive steel fulfill the requirements and have different benefits. So I think there's part of participating in the bigger debate and defining what success looks for that organization, more or less aligned to the environment.
And just in terms of scale of 1 to 10, I mean, where is climate in terms of the discussions?
I find it very hard to give a number, but I would say in some of my board, it's probably closer to 6. In others, it's closer to 3. Where I would look at is also, are we looking at pockets of sustainability, measuring carbon, measuring waste, or are we bringing it together into a coherent message? And I think for even closer to an 8 or a 10, I would like to see that consistency, which is we seldom have.
Right. And Stacey, I know, the boards that you're on, just give us a sense. It's kind of baked into the DNA, yes?
Yeah, so I sit on a couple of boards of organizations that by design, like Elaine, are kind of trying to do good for the environment and good for climate. The Green Bank is a bank that only invests in things that are part of the energy transition and climate resilience. Winrock is a nonprofit. It's a Rockefeller associated nonprofit that works on sustainability broadly in emerging markets and in the United States. And Climate Policy Initiative is an NGO think tank that specifically looks at questions around climate and investment. So those boards are very much kind of thinking about climate change in everything they do. The awareness is there, the understanding is deep, and the ability to push deeply into the kind of areas that they're working on as part of the actual kind of mission of those organizations. I will say I've been on some boards and I've consulted as part of my advisory work. I've consulted with organizations who are just coming to the topic of climate change, and they come at it in pretty distinct ways, but not holistic ways. So sometimes you'll find organizations are thinking about the opportunity set, which new markets to get into. Is clean energy an investable kind of asset class that makes sense to add into their work? But a lot of times, and this is increasing pretty quickly, it's coming through the risk side of things. And Elaine kind of mentioned something that I thought was pretty important to connect up with Shari's opening keynote address, which is that for a lot of organizations, particularly when they think about risk, they don't necessarily think about climate, but climate is a threat multiplier for all of the risks that they normally manage inside their organization, whether it's supply chain risk, whether it's market risk, and things like that. So sometimes the awareness inside an organization and then at the board level starts with that. This is kind of exacerbating risks that I have on my risk register already. I will then say, for those companies that are thinking about it, the board tends to be the place, because climate is a big macro question. It's not specific to any industry. It doesn't you know, it doesn't
Yeah.
observe borders. It is something that the boards tend to think about from a big picture strategy perspective.
So thank you. I'd love to get into just some practicalities now in terms of what techniques or methods are you using to influence boards and management. And Elaine, I'll start with you.
Well, I think looking at what Stacy just said is a broad thing, but what we really need to do is to take this big picture and put it into bite-sized projects and initiatives. Help the board understand the relevance of the action as well as the inaction. And each of these initiatives can actually be its own business case on why we want to do it and how are we going to measure it. So a proactive approach can really be simply like, let's just measure our carbon footprint of our business travel. Does that mean that we will reduce our travel activities and so reduce our footprint? Or is travel really necessary? It's part of the operation, so we might have to buy carbon credits to offset our footprint. But a reactive example is really something that climate is impacting our business. So let's say an agriculture company that grows pineapples. They realize that the crop yield is declining, so we have less pineapple to sell. Why? Because the health of the soil is depleting, because after many, many years of growing only pineapples for 50 years, that's against nature. So to improve that yield, we really need to have to adopt regenerative agriculture practices, such as crop rotation, to improve the health of soil. But agriculture takes a long time before you can see the results. So ROIs might not be there immediately, but it is a must do. And this is really different for each business. And this is just it just means that you can't keep doing the same thing. And when you start to look at doing things differently, there is an opportunity to factor in more sustainable solutions.
Absolutely. So I'm curious, in terms of your experience, what are the drivers of transformative change inside of an organization? How can we actually use the board voice to make climate action and be bold about it? Lara, you have a suggestion there?
Yeah, so for me, it starts with data. You have to be curious, you have to ask high-level questions. And there is this concept of double materiality, where boards are responsible for financial performance, but also for non-financial performance and risk. Once you have assessed where the pockets of opportunity are and what is most significant, then you can start to drive change. And then it really goes through culture. For the board, it might be emotional engagement. It might mean not appealing only through data, but making it a story, making it an on-site visit, making it concrete. For the organization, it comes through how do we drive the culture? Do we have the right levels of skills? Do we need to hire some different people, add them to the team, train the existing team? How do we create that discussion? How do we engage all levels of the organization? So it is borderline because it's a collaboration with the executive where the board can have the executives back in doing those things, but also determining KPIs and success criteria and eventually making it about what are we about, what do we want to be known for, and what does
I'm
it
just
mean?
curious, have you come up with any climate KPIs that you're using that are effective? Because that's
Yes,
really what drives boards, right? Is performance.
yes, absolutely. So for one of our organization, we're looking at carbon footprint, we're looking at waste, and particularly plastic waste. And I should have said there's total KPIs such as total carbon. There's also operational KPIs such as what percentage of our waste gets recycled or what percentage of our procurement is sustainable. So we're looking at both of those. In the built environment, we're looking at skills, and then we're looking at what we can do in the new build and energy efficiency, what we can do in retrofit. But we have KPIs in terms of performance and
Perfect.
progress.
Yeah, that's really important. And Stacy, I want to make sure that you have an opportunity to talk a bit about really how transformative change has been taking it from a governance perspective, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the kind of drivers of transformative change inside an organization, from what the board can affect really are around two big things. One is the governance and the other is risk management. And these come together in many different ways in an organization. One of those kind of drivers of good governance around climate change and risk and good governance around risk management has been the rise in ways in which organizations think about how to identify, assess, quantify, manage, and then disclose climate-related risks and opportunities. Obviously, the disclosure discussion gets a lot of airtime these days. The SEC just announced its ruling yesterday. The European Union has had a disclosure requirement for some time. California has one. But that disclosure kind of pressure is at the end of organizations' ability to get their hands around what risks do they sit on from a climate perspective and what opportunities can they capture. And that's where the board really can take an important role in helping management get their hands around that. And then, figuring out how to get out in front of it, because doing things that are sustainable, resilient, and consistent with the net zero transitions will ultimately be competitive advantages as well. I also want to make the connection between what Laura just said and KPIs, because one of the ways that the most famous framework around disclosure is called the TCFD. It's obviously been retired for the ISSB, but one of the things they have in there from a KPI perspective is whether management has a remuneration package tied to the implementation of good climate sustainable actions. Those climate sustainable actions come as a result of an implementation plan after putting that strategy together. And remuneration obviously drives a lot of good behavior, and some bad behavior, but in terms of putting those KPIs together around incentivizing your key managers and your CEO to really take a company forward on the climate journey, it's a pretty important one.
And I know we don't really have the time, but we know that the SEC just came out with their guidelines yesterday. And we believe that that is actually going to accelerate a lot of activity at the board level. I know the boards I sit on, in anticipation of the SEC, we've already been thinking about the strategy and readying our disclosures and our reporting. So I think we are making good progress. With our limited time left, I did want to take just a few minutes to just talk about how do we get more women on boards, right? And tapping into your personal experiences to help the women of this community understand how their voices can be amplified by getting on a board. So I'm going to start with you first, Elaine. You could hit your first board role and maybe just an idea of like how to get people engaged.
Well, what got me my first board role was my LinkedIn profile, because a recruiter said to me, when I read your profile, I knew that you would want to sign up to do on the board of the UN World Food Program because the values align. I don't remember what my LinkedIn profile said, but I kind of know that now it's important. But really, when we look at wanting to get on boards, I speak to a lot of women. The first question I ask them is, do you understand what is the board, a role of a board director? And if you do, sometimes I actually recommend to do a course. Not that you need it if you already know, but sometimes it's just a hygiene factor. It's to check the box so that someone can not to say, oh, you're not qualified for it. It's like, of course I'm qualified. I have a certificate. Then the next thing is go and tell everyone in your network that's what you want to do, because that's where it's going to be helping you get to that role. So just have the courage to look at what you stand for. Don't be afraid to find companies that aligns with your values, your passion. And regardless, you have the experience or not. You got to try.
Love that advice. Laura?
So I'll complement what Elaine said. I got my first role, I would say, because I applied. It was actually published in a newspaper. And I would say, look at your expertise and what you can bring. So for me, I found this beautiful organization who needed digital transformation and C-suite experience and international experience. I happen to have the three. I had no qualifications to be on a board. I just sent them a cover letter. They told me that they loved it. They got me on board. So look at what you can bring. Look at which organizations are looking for that, regardless of they're big, they're small, they're scary, you don't feel prepared, and just ask. Another way could be to leverage communities like this one. being other senior women, say, hey, I'm preparing my board interview, or hey, I'm thinking this, what do you advise? People are much more willing to help than we think sometimes. And our role, I think, being on boards is once you have a seat at the table, stand up, go open the door and open it to more people. And this can be women, this can be other minorities. So I think we're here to support each other.
Absolutely. And Stacy, any words of wisdom? I'm
Well,
curious, so just a quick question. Of the boards you're on, are you the only women or are there multiple women?
That's a great question. And I think my experience is that some boards I'm on are kind of fairly good in terms of gender balance, and some of them I am the only person, the only woman, and that has a different dynamic. I mean, so kind of echoing what Laura said at the very end, once you get on a board, open the door for other women. Representation doesn't mean just one woman on a board. It actually means equal representation reflecting that these organizations work in. So that's pretty important. I would also echo something Elaine said, which is, raise your hand, volunteer for boards, but also try and understand how different boards work, because boards of nonprofits are very different than boards of public companies. Boards of entities that are, kind of really looking kind of for their board to be advisors as opposed to governing, are also different. Sometimes those boards are really about fundraising as opposed to governing and managing. So figure out kind of how boards work and how different boards work for different organizations. And then volunteer, like Laura said, just raise your hand, put yourself out there. You're going to learn along the way, and that's going to be pretty interesting and exciting. I can tell you that all of my boards have been fairly unique experiences, and all very informative and part of my learning journey.
So with our last minute, the last word, I'm going to do a quick round. Laura, what do you want to leave this group with?
Just try it out. Find where you can add value and do it, because we need it.
Terrific. Stacy?
One of the things we didn't talk about, but I really want to leave on the table, is that all climate and sustainability issues have bottom line implications. If you're on a board or looking to join a board through the angle of climate change, it's not just about ESG, it's also about financial implications.
Well, thank you to Elaine, Lara, and Stacy for sharing your insights and experiences with us. I hope that we get to continue this conversation. We know that one voice, one individual can make change. And if we get that one voice and one individual on a board, they can amplify that change. So thank you very much. Back to you, Michelle.
Wow, what a powerful conversation, and so timely with the new SEC disclosure ruling taking place yesterday. Thank you to all of our speakers for a very invigorating conversation. Next up, we have our first hot take of the day from Anne-Therese Gennari.
Take is that it's about time we get super intentional about how we communicate the climate crisis. Adapting a mindful and uplifting approach has nothing to do with denial. We're facing a lot of uncertainty and unpredictable changes, and for that we need to activate inner leadership and resiliency while nurturing the curiosity and courage necessary to try new things. Doom and gloom will not activate that for us. For that we need informed and empowered optimism.
Hi, I'm Katie Ryan, Director of Sustainability here at Green Biz Group, and I'm leading a session on climate displacement. We're lucky that we get to hear from experts like Jocelyn and Asha, who I will introduce now. Jocelyn Watt is the CEO of Alight. Alight is a global humanitarian NGO. You might know Jocelyn as a social entrepreneur and from her work as co-founder from IDEO.org. She is based in New York City. We also get to talk with Asha Natalia Maharaj. She's an international gender expert and consultant. Her work sits at the intersection of climate, gender, and policy. She brings a Caribbean, small island developing states point of view and is based in Trinidad and Tobago. I am so lucky to get to lift up these voices of Jocelyn and Asha. And I'd like to ask you a question first, Jocelyn. I mean, let's start at the very beginning and make sure we have our foundations in place. Can you share the basics of displacement and how it relates to the climate crisis?
Sure. So climate displacement is an ever increasing challenge. Over the past decade, we've seen 21.5 million new displacements a year due to conflict. Sometimes these are folks that are crossing borders and moving from one country to another, but most of the time these are people that are internally displaced, staying within the borders of their own country. So this is actually 2 times more displacements each year that we're seeing than those that we're seeing due to conflict or violence.
That's so interesting. Asha, when you and I were talking, I said that I have a love for Mythbusters, and you had some great points on common misunderstandings about climate displacement. Could you go into those a little bit?
Sure, thanks, Katie. I also have a love for Mythbusters, and so I have 4 myths I think that I can correct for us here. The first thing is that displacement does not always mean people moving from east to west and south to north. We know that oftentimes people imagine that displaced persons flee to other countries. However, actually, the vast majority of persons who are forced to move do so within their own countries and regions. And in fact, statistics tell us that 70% of climate refugees actually live in countries neighboring their own or their own. And second is that displacement is not always physical. It can also happen at socioeconomic levels as well. For example, in the Caribbean, sectors that are dependent on for livelihoods, including fisheries and agriculture, are increasingly shrinking, depleting, and becoming non-viable. And so this leaves significant amounts of skilled workers and those who are involved throughout the value chains economically displaced. Third, displacement does not affect everybody equally. The testimonies of people who are directly impacted often show that both the slow and rapid onset effects of climate change are negatively impacting the most basic rights of, yes, entire communities, but also those who are already marginalized and racialized within those zones. And building on that, gender inequity also does exist in displacement. Women in developing countries are often more likely to be left behind when male family members migrate, and thus women are more often internally displaced. And this can be seen especially in countries like Somalia, where the vast majority of internally displaced persons in informal settlements are women and children. And this type of displacement, of course, leaves women at heightened risks of gender-based violence, lack of access to reproductive care, and of course, higher risk of poverty. So overall, although data on climate displacement is largely limited, what we do know about displacement tells us that we need to consider the needs of the most vulnerable and provide multifaceted solutions that enable displaced persons to address their most pressing needs.
I'd love to get into some of those solutions. Jocelyn, when you and I were talking, I framed the question as, what's going well? And I think you had a really great pivot to that topic. So could you share a little bit more about what is working?
Sure. So, I think that there's different ways in which we can tackle climate displacement and in particular support women and girls who we know are disproportionately impacted by climate change and also by displacement. And so the first is really, what are the efforts that we can look at to really build resilience and prevent people from having to be displaced? So some of the work that Alight is doing, for instance, in Somalia, is around building water catchment systems with communities so that they can harvest the rainwater and then have that during the times of prolonged drought. We work on creating household gardens with people so that they, again, have access to food, even and planting drought-resistant crops so that even when we don't see the rains, people are still able to feed themselves and their communities. At the same time, though, there are people that will be displaced when there are climate emergencies. These could be, wildfires in Maui or California. These could be floods in Pakistan. This could be massive food insecurity and prolonged years of drought in the Horn of Africa. And in these instances, it's really important to provide the protection to people, in particular to women and children, on those journeys of displacement. And so for us, that looks like emergency feeding stations. That looks like provision of health clinics or mobile clinics so that women can continue access to contraception and reproductive health care and maternal support, and so as well as gender-based violence protection. And then the last piece of it is really, how do we help people resettle and build new lives once they do land in the outskirts of a city or in a new urban area or a new village that they've fled to? And so in these instances, we often are working with women to help them identify different livelihood opportunities or entrepreneurship opportunities, helping to ensure that children can get back in school and that women can have continuity of healthcare. And so we really look at it at Alight along all aspects of that journey, from the prevention and resilience through the emergency support phase, and then to the adaptation and really rebuilding lives once they've resettled in a new place.
Jocelyn, I am just so grateful for the work that Alight is doing out there. It is remarkable. And I know as bold attendees all here today, we all want to have influence and be able to support the people who need supporting in this kind of crisis. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about what we can do at the number of different inflection points that all of us here as bold attendees have. So really looking for specific actions we can take. Asha, I'd love for you to touch on what concerned citizens and policymakers can do, and then turn it back over to Jocelyn for inflection points from corporates and also directly as displaced persons. Asha, go ahead.
For sure. So starting with the policy level, I think what really needs to be done is that we need to advance both the institutional and legal architecture. And this is at both national and international levels, so that we can really comprehensively address climate-induced displacement, making sure that we're providing protections to displaced people, particularly women, racialized persons, and other highly vulnerable groups. At the past 3 COP conferences, I know that concerns have been raised about the representation of women. And at COP28 last year, the delegation of forcibly displaced persons actually included less than 10 persons in attendance in total. And SIDS, small island developing states like mine, who often experience the most intense impacts of climate change, are also severely represented on stage. So what is necessary then is to really ensure that there is meaningful representation of the most vulnerable in the room, and space for them to play active roles in shaping resilience and displacement policies that are more ambitious. Their knowledge, I think, is also crucial to the development of localized programs and even the accountability mechanisms. And then thinking at a more informal level, for those of us who are just concerned citizens, which I think all of us here are, we need to collectively reimagine what migration can and should look like for displaced persons. And what we're seeing is countries that contribute the least to climate change suffering the most from disasters and displacement. And those of us, especially in what is better known as the global north, need to decide what it really means to be accountable. I think that we need to stay informed and advocate, and information on what is happening in various regions around the world is readily accessible. So staying informed, advocating at home to keep our countries accountable for their response is something we can all do. And I mean, I think we've definitely even done that today by furthering our collective awareness through this event. So with that, I pass it over to Jocelyn.
Great, thanks so much. In terms of corporations, I think there's so much that corporations can do. One example I'll give, I sit on the board of Airbnb.org, and Airbnb.org's mandate is really to provide temporary housing to people that have experienced displacement. These could be people who have experienced displacement due to climate, the support for Ukrainians fleeing Ukraine over the past couple years has been a big area of their focus, but also they provide temporary housing to people who have had to flee their homes due to climate as well. For instance, recent responses with the wildfire in Maui, in California, the earthquake in Turkey and Syria. And so, companies like Airbnb.org can think about, what are the products or offerings that they have that could really benefit those who have experienced displacement. Uber is another example. They have been giving Alight ride credits for the past couple years to be able to help displaced people get to new housing opportunities or doctor's appointments or register for benefits or whatever it is that they need to be able to do. Airbnb.org has been a big partner of ours at Alight as well, and we were able to secure really substantial in-kind support from them to be able to provide housing to about 17,000 displaced Ukrainians for up to 30 days across Europe and the US and around the world. And so I think companies do have an opportunity to provide both financial support to organizations that are working with displaced communities, but also to really think about how their products or services could be utilized by these populations in these moments of need. In terms of displaced people themselves, I think, we all need to do a better job of listening to and engaging displaced populations in the solutions that we're suggesting or in the work that we're doing. At Alight, one of our core strategies is around co-creation. And so every service and program that Alight delivers has been co-created with displaced people. Co-creation is an aspect of human-centered design where we really look to engage local communities in creating the solutions because we know that proximity that they have, that lived experience that they have, it really does make them experts at what is most needed in these contexts. And so I just encourage everyone to ensure that we are employing tools of co-creation, that we are engaging displaced communities in the solutions, that we're hearing and sharing their stories, uplifting their voices, and really platforming them to be the ones to share what these experiences are like and what their needs are.
Thank you so much. It's so important. I had wanted to close with asking each of you for one last final statement, and we are, out of time, as the platform says. Please do follow Jocelyn and Asha, at least on LinkedIn, if you are not already. They're fantastic resources sitting at the center of this issue. They're wonderful. Michelle, you've curated a fantastic lineup of speakers. So we're so grateful to be a part of it, and I'll hand it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katie, Jocelyn, and Asha. I'm so glad we had the opportunity to shed light on the topic of displacement. Displacement is not only physical, but is also economical. Co-creation with displaced communities is key. Next up, our next hot take will be from Sean Conway-Wood.
I'm Sean Conway-Wood, and my hot take is that the next government will be the last government with the power to create real change before 2030 and that all-important climate and nature deadline. With more than half of the world going to the polls this year, now is the time for us to come together, stand up and demand real policy and legislation change. The oil industry has lobbyists, now it's time that the climate and nature sector had them too.
Such striking commentary, Sean. Now is the time to stand up and come together. Next up, a conversation on women and COP negotiators. Simge, over to you.
Thank you, Michelle. Welcome to the panel on women and COP negotiators. When it comes to women negotiators at international climate conferences such as COP, the numbers are not in their favor. Women often represent the minority in a country delegation, and their speaking time is often significantly less than those of their male counterparts. We are not surprised. So today we want to discover what other factors are against women and how we can turn the table around. I'm Simge, community champion at the Global Shapers community, and it's my honor to host this panel with Frances Fuller, head of global offices at Climate Analytics, serving as the director of the North America office in New York City, and previously directly working with the UN Secretary General of the United Nations, former climate negotiator for the small island developing state of Antigua and Barbuda. Next up, we have Lisa Lang. She's Director for EU Affairs and Policy Orchestrator at the European Institute for Innovation and Technology within the Climate Knowledge and Innovation Community. This is the EU's main climate innovation initiative. Lisa also is chairperson for the Cultural and Creative Task Force of the UNFCCC's United Nations Global Innovation Hub. And today she's joining us from Brussels in Belgium. Last but not least, we have Marie-Claire Graff, co-founder of the Youth Negotiators Academy, leading the Climate Youth Negotiators program, joining today from Geneva, previously UN Youth Climate Champion and Climate Negotiator for Switzerland. So what is COP? What are negotiations? And why should we care? Fran, would love to hear from you.
Thanks so much, Singain, and thanks for inviting me to this important panel. And it's been really interesting to listen to all of the speakers before. Well, COP or the Conference of the Parties is essentially the supreme decision-making body of the climate change process, and it takes place annually. It brings together all parties to the UNFCCC, so governments who have essentially formally joined the treaties, the climate change treaties, the Paris Agreement, the Kyoto Protocol, and the Convention, basically to take decisions on how to implement the treaty, promote climate action. It brings together world leaders, negotiators, and other stakeholders to essentially discuss and try to agree collectively on how to combat climate change. I guess on the second part of the question, the negotiations, which essentially happen mainly between government representatives, but are very much influenced by conversations that happen in the corridors and through side events, are critical because they essentially set the global climate agenda through setting targets like the 1.5 temperature limit of the Paris Agreement, the recent agreement on tripling renewables by 2030, or the new climate finance goal that's going to be agreed at the end of this year at the next COP. So our attention and our engagement really matters because it essentially determines how we prioritize issues year after year, and it sends signals to the outside world.
Thank you, Fran. So interesting. So, Marie-Claire, would it be possible that you share some statistics on women at COP and COP negotiations following up on this?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for convening all of us. And yeah, when it comes to the numbers, unfortunately, we are still not at the 50-50%. Unfortunately, we see that there is an underrepresentation of women, specifically also marginalized women from countries, from smaller countries we heard before, also from the island nations, but also young women, basically young entrepreneurs coming in. So like this diverse background is really, really missing. And currently around 1/3 of the negotiators are actually women. And obviously this needs to increase, but also the diversity of women who are actually part of these negotiations need to increase. So that's kind of really like talking about the numbers of people being there. And of course, then also it's like, are you actually leading a negotiation? Are you actually able to speak up, right? Because sometimes you also have like, the female note takers who are not allowed to speak. So I think like it's really important to then go like a more granular level. And what we see that, 1/3 of the participants in the negotiations are women. But when it comes to speaking time, unfortunately, we see like it even like, a decrease in the participation of women speaking. What we saw, there was a tiny little increase of women participation over the last 10 years, but honestly, like 10 years would have been an awful lot of time to actually get to the 50-50%. But another challenge which I would like to highlight is that, when we see the funding for the delegations, very often we see that women are deprioritized, which again, like just brings another inequality level to the table. So we have kind of less women with less speaking time, and then the funding doesn't go there, so they cannot actually adequately prepare for the negotiations. And then also there's the last layer maybe which I would like to highlight is that the negotiations are always happening in English. And very often, you know, especially like women from the communities, they speak like so many indigenous languages, but they might not be fluent in English. And it's such a hard barrier for them to meaningfully and effectively engage in these negotiations, yet their voices are exactly the ones we need to solve the climate crisis.
Wow. Thank you, Marie-Claire, for sharing these really impressive numbers and making it crystal clear that these numbers are not in our favor. So how does it feel to be inside rooms like the UN or COP negotiations rooms? Lisa, could you share from your experience?
Yes, thank you. And also to add to that, if you actually look into the number of the LGBTQ communities, then the numbers are even more worse. So going into rooms like this, it feels very much gray. So there are not very colorful variations. And that is actually always our concern, is because diversity means a broad 360-degree approach on solutions. And the risk is here is that if we are too narrow, then we have blind spots, and that means we are missing out. And that then will be blockers in systemic change. And, you know, in case you have wondered why we haven't had very systemic changes recently or in the last 28 COPs, is one of those things is because we have very narrow approaches, which are due to very narrow and non-diverse negotiating rooms and decisions. So that is the systemic failure we have. And on, you know, feeling going in the room, it's really like this. It's like, because, you know, also we have a lot of emotion. So this is the thing, is like with, especially when you work in policy, is you always have to see that there is a system and a protocol and a formality to it. And then is the informal, emotional, political, Hunger Games, Games of Thrones kind of approach to it. And it becomes, especially for like new negotiators, it can become very confusing. So it starts with that we are using our own language. It's like full of abbreviations, which quite frankly, when I started to get into this, sometimes I just went on a toilet break and Googled terms and then just wrote it down and came back. So because you don't get a handbook, like this is the first thing, it's like with the onboarding, it's like, what does that all mean? And on the one side, abbreviations are used for shortcuts, but also they can be used as blockers, like to create barriers. So that's like the first thing, it's an own language. And then the other bit is like the culture of is like it can become quite heated, it can become quite emotional, but also then it refers to papers and like to this, and you have no idea, you know, you feel like you need a Wikipedia of where to go. And again, it feels very, very exclusive. So when I started to go in, I kind of felt like I need like a buddy or somebody who just like, you know, briefs me how to interact. And then over time you become better at it. But all of that makes the process slower. And then actually the real conversations happen before and after the official rooms. So this is also, and there's a lot of buddy business going on, a lot of coffee negotiations. So you just have to be like, COP really feels like you have to be alert 24/7. And then after 2 weeks in COP, it feels like you need to go in rehab to assimilate in real life. So and then usually we get all sick because we're totally exhausted. We've been running around. We forgot to drink and to eat and to sleep. So it really feels like a marathon. It's kind of an Ironman for climate change, I think. So we are completely exhausted afterwards.
Yeah, thank you for sharing, Lisa. There is so much to learn about COP and international climate conferences. And I would really like to come back to Fran and MC to better understand, why does diversity in international climate negotiations matter? You both have been climate negotiators representing your country at COPs. And what are the implications on diversity on local, international, and of course, national level?
Thanks. And I think pegging on what Lisa mentioned, it is such a complex negotiation. It covers issues from from migration to trade to it's all of these issues under one umbrella, and it touches on everything. And so therefore diversity matters in many different ways. But specifically as it relates to like representation, it really needs diversity is so important because it needs to ensure that all of the varied impacts on climate change which affects everybody, but not equally, especially those that are most vulnerable, really need to be taken into account in how you effectively craft solutions that will be sustainable and that will be impactful for all, and that can be taken from an international level and interpreted to national and subnational policy. So really at the national and local level, it means that you need to be able to see yourselves reflected in that international policy decision, and you need to be able to take that and craft your national response to it. I mean, at the international level, having diversity and representation, it just strengthens the legitimacy of an international agreement. It strengthens the effectiveness of it, and it strengthens the ability for you to then implement that across the globe, because you're coming to a room in which you're essentially having 200 different countries negotiate and come to one agreement on one outcome that can then be applicable to everybody. So while it needs to be reflective of all of that and general enough for everybody to see themselves in, it needs to be able to touch on that. And ultimately it needs to have sustainable solutions to the climate crisis with the aim of ensuring that nobody is left behind.
Yeah, maybe just to add on this one, I mean, the participation of women is a human right. We have a right to engage in decision-making processes. We have a right of representing our own voices through our own voice, not through others who then might represent our voices more or less. And this is also really important for Indigenous women, right? For the women from rural areas, for young women. That's why we specifically at the Youth Negotiators Academy are training young women from all around the world to take their seats and actively, demand that there needs to be a space for them to actually be heard and decision-making table. So not only in advisory positions, which is great, right? Which you can have anyways, but we also need to have them literally sitting these tables where the decisions are taken. But it can also be really daunting, as Lisa, you outlined very, very much before. And I think that's why it's so important that we not only demand that young people or general women are sitting at the table, but also we are preparing them and we're supporting them, because otherwise we might have 50-50, but because they're so overwhelmed, they might not be able to speak, or because they're emotionally drained, or there's a lot of things happening at these COP, as Lisa mentioned. You need a rehab afterwards to actually get back. So that's why we're really investing a lot of time in capacity building and community building before, to really, when they come in, they're actually going to be effective and meaningfully engaged and can really bring their points to the table. So I think this is a really crucial point.
Thank you. So we are running into the last minute of our panel. So Lisa, any last hot takes or ideas on how we can get more women onto the negotiator's seat?
So I really liked what Marie-Claire just said. It's because you need a boot camp. Also because in context COP, also there are actually retreat and workshops before and in between. So, for instance, we have the UNFCCC retreat in June in Bonn at the headquarters. And then we have the Future Summit in New York in September. So that's actually where the real work gets done, with all of the workshops. So, but from experience, it's the people who are in should open the doors for other people to come inside. And that goes diverse, gender, everyone. So as an example, we at Climate Kick, because, we've been around in these communities because we are representing the European Commission on everything climate. We are the Implementation and Innovation Agency. So together with our CEO, Kirsten Dunlop, we simply decided we are bringing in a whole new community, arts and culture and entertainment, because they haven't been left inside officially in the beginning. So already 2 years ago, we are we are in the co-secretariat of the United Nations Global Innovation Hub, and we are facilitating content. So we simply just said, how about we will start running panels on the topic and we will invite people who have never been at COP. And then we realized we actually had to run boot camps to not only explain all of these abbreviations, but also to set up spreadsheets for accreditation process and how to finance the travel for them because there are no funds. So that was really systemically change, is that we just said, like, we are sitting inside, we are bringing people in. We can't do it by the hundreds, but then we can do it symbolically. And then what happened 2 years ago is that we were able to point and say, like, hello, arts and culture, there is a place for you. Here, it is on the official schedule, believe us. So, and then in between, we just like ran courses and training workshops, and sometimes it feels a little bit like self-help groups, but now we actually changed the narrative.
Really cool. Thank you. So other women bringing more women into the room. Back to you, Michelle. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Simge, Frances, Lisa, and Mary Claire. A very timely conversation with COP29 just around the corner. Women in Climate will be following COP29 developments closely. Next up, we're highlighting bold solutions. Homara, over to you.
Michelle, thank you so much. What an insightful conversation. We're now on the final segment of Bold, where we're discussing bold solutions. My name is Humera Chowdhury. I'm a journalist, presenter, and moderator based here in Doha, Qatar. Let me introduce you to our first guest. She's Jo Mehta. She's the CEO and the co-founder of Stop Ecocide International, and supports the establishment of ecocide as a crime at the International Criminal Court, and she joins us from the UK. Our second speaker is Leslie Field. She's the founder and CEO of the company Bright Ice Initiative and works on preserving reflective Arctic and glacial ice, otherwise known as refreezing the Arctic. She joins us from the US. Ladies, thank you so much for joining us. Jojo, I'm going to start with you. First of all, can you describe for us what solution you're working on?
So our international advocacy organisation, Stop Ecocide International, is working on one very specific thing, which is driving the conversation towards legislation to criminalise the worst harms to nature, which is now increasingly known around the world as ecocide.
Leslie, how about you? What's the solution you're working on?
Yes, I have a slide set that could go through it with pictures that helps it go quickly. Is it okay to share that?
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
Super, thank you. So let's put this on its thing and get it sharing. Okay. Always fun to try to share on Zoom. Hold on a sec. I'm sorry. Oh, come on. Okay. Share screen. Over to I love to set it up in advance if I can, but here we go. I think this should work. I'm sorry for the wasted time. I do work on preserving ice, as has been said, and this should be sharing it, I would think. Are you seeing it yet?
No, not yet, Leslie. But while you're trying to do that, why don't you talk us through the solution that you're working on? And if we're able to see the slides, great. And if not, maybe another time.
Yeah, all right. Yeah, I know you're short on time. Basically, I've been hearing that you folks really get this, that the climate has become unstable. It's really in an unsustainable place. And lots of people are suffering already. And women's voices in this are kind of few. I agree with all of that. It happens I'm an engineer who, realized when she was about 11 years old that she wanted to be an inventor. And so did this, in a time before that was even remotely cool. But I think what's nice about that is that it gives us, I'm just going to give up on the slides, I guess. It gives women have a different perspective, I think, where we think more about the long term, about what's the welfare of our kids going to be. And it means that when we decide to take on climate, we decide to do it in a big way. What I've been working on is trying to preserve Arctic and glacial ice, sea ice and glacial ice. And the reason is that it's something that, it too is being underrepresented, if you will. The reflectivity that we've been getting for free from our planet of having ice in various regions, especially in 24-hour-a-day summer sunlight, has been keeping things cooler and more stable for a long, long time, for as long as humanity's been around. And lately, over the last several decades, and the photos, would show you better, but we've been losing ice at a rapid pace. It's been just accelerating. It's been a terrible thing. It's in what's called a positive feedback loop, meaning the more it happens, the faster it keeps happening. And that means that we're heating up more than, by a factor of 1.5 times as fast as we would have had this not been the case. So this means it's a leverage point. It's a thing that one can do, is to try to preserve ice so that we can slow things down, so that we can get to all this sustainable transition that we need to do, but that we know to get the infrastructure turned over and to get people serious about acting like our lives depended on it. It takes some time. And so this is to keep things cooler, more sustainable water supplies, all these things. Without this, you end up getting the risks of displacing many, many populations, risking the food supply of about 1/3 of the world from, for instance, the water that comes down from the Himalayas in a so far somewhat predictable pattern. And the other thing that people talked about here that I really love is that this inclusiveness, this co-leadership with people who live in the area is exactly, and have expertise on their local conditions, is exactly why we said yes when we were asked to potentially work in the Himalayas, so that we can work with people who live there. We have environmental impact assessment specialists, glaciologists who live in the area and can advise us on making sure that as you do a careful small scale test in the way that one of our largest scientific societies in the US, the American Geophysical Union, I got to help them with their framework for solutions, so that you can do this in an inclusive, transparent way, make sure everybody is included, make sure there's no unknown risk that people are worried about, and you can get ahead, with getting a solution tested. If you can't test it, you really don't know if it works. You have good theories.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so those
Absolutely.
are
So
kind of the main points. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, no, not at all. Can you then explain why your solution is important?
Yes, and why it needs more highlighting too. Yeah, thank you. It's because if we can keep ice in place in these areas longer, and we've done a lot of research testing, peer-reviewed papers published, so it's gone through a lot of critical review. We can slow down the ice melt by 30%, for instance, make it last 30% longer, which is enough to potentially rebuild the ice. When you're in the Arctic, because of its ice loss and these positive feedback loops, has been warming 3 to 6 times faster than anywhere else on the planet. This is a dire thing. What's happening is we're destabilizing our traditional climate patterns. We're getting stronger storms. We're getting harsher conditions there. And we've already, one of the slides that would be really depressing, but here it is in words, is that we have already in the US, one country over 3 decades, have lost or had to make up for $2.25 trillion in damages just from climate events over 3 decades in just one country in the world. And we're not the worst affected country. And so this is a really dire thing that, where does the money come from? I'm not sure. I founded this as a nonprofit so we could get the permissions to do our work, and people know our agenda is clean. But the money is being lost if we don't do this work, and we don't have much time. Just as you folks have been saying, it's these tipping points are nearing. Methane releases are going to be larger. Methane is natural gas, by the way. I love that a lot of climate scientists are now calling this unnatural gas because it's fossil fuel. And it forces temperatures up even faster than CO2 in the short term. And the short term is what we have. So this is no longer a future problem. It's here. Solutions like ours help communities develop their own resilience while we're making sure that there is absolutely nothing that's harmful in what we do to anything in the area. And if there is, we change the solution. I live in Silicon Valley. You're used to pivoting. If there's a problem, of course, we're going to change that. And you try
time
that.
Time is of the essence. Sorry to cut you there, Leslie, but I want to pivot now to
very appropriate.
Jojo. Now, just before we run out of time. So Jojo, can you explain why your solution is so important?
Absolutely. I think in the climate space, we don't pay enough attention to the power of legal interventions. And particularly, we focus on criminal law because it's what we also understand to draw the moral red lines in our culture. And, despite all our intellectual knowledge about, how fast we're moving towards tipping points and so on, we may know those things intellectually, but do we actually act on them? Part of the issue is a very long-standing systemic culture of, separating ourselves from nature, treating it as something other, treating it as something that we can exploit with an infinite bank of resources. And when we go back to the key sort of root causes of climate change, what we find is mass destruction of nature repeatedly over a long period of time. And emissions are a significant part of that, but they're not the entirety either. If we stopped all our emissions tomorrow, but we carried on destroying vital ecosystems that are climate regulating, we would still have a climate crisis. And so the solution of actually criminalizing those worst harms addresses at least three key aspects. Firstly, it creates a deterrent and a mechanism for accountability at the highest level for those that are making key decisions that actually are capable of creating severe and widespread or long-term harm to the living world. You're also looking at effectively the reinforcement of existing law. There is plenty of environmental law around the world, but it's often badly followed, woefully monitored, poorly enforced, and that speaks back to that cultural issue. Even existing environmental crimes, which are as lucrative as drug trafficking, they're way up there in terms of criminal activity, but they're not paid anything like the same attention to. And that is partly because we simply don't perceive harm to nature, and particularly severe harm to nature, as beyond the pale and unacceptable. And that's what criminalization can do as well. So it has effectively this kind of the level of deterrence and accountability, the level of reinforcement, creating a kind of container for existing law, as well as shifting cultural mindsets. And just as a small example, on a board of directors, you're going to be paying much more attention to fulfilling your environmental obligations if you know that, you breach those regulations or you don't tick those right boxes and you create a threat of a severe level of harm. You could be looking at personal, criminal liability, and that would obviously create a total, shift in how those things are approached. Instead of your risk managers and your legal counsels trying to sort of dance around whether or not you fit into a certain category or cross a certain precise line, instead they're going to be linking what's actually happening on the ground to the level of harm it might create, and that is a fundamental shift.
And that's all we have time for, I'm afraid. So I'm going to have to shift back to Michelle. Thank you to all our speakers. Back to you, Michelle.
Wow, what a mind-flowing day of bold conversations. Reflectivity we've been getting for free. We can't depend on that anymore. Creating new laws and enforcing existing laws to protect nature. I'll definitely be following Jojo's work closely and Ecocide closely. I really can't think of a better way to honor International Women's Day. Uplifting the voices of women and bringing bold topics to light is the way to go. For some of us, bold continues today. We're hosting after parties in cities around the world, including New York, Dubai, Frankfurt, Ottawa, Exeter, Washington, D.C., and Boston. For all of us, many of us may just be getting started on our climate journey. We have resources at Women in Climate for those that are new to climate, including a special Slack channel and a recorded webinar on our website. For those that have already started our climate journey, be bold, create dialogue, and create solutions. Thank you to Alight, and We Don't Have Time for supporting Bold. Thank you to all of our volunteers. We'll see you all soon.